Hey, welcome to the Regents Roundtable. I'm Stephen Ludwig. Our guest today is Ken McConnellogue. Ken and I used to work together at the University of Colorado for 12 years when I was a regent, and he was the head of public relations for the University of Colorado system. He held the role of vice president of communications for the university for 16 years. Prior to that, he was at the University of Northern Colorado in a similar role. And before he joined the University of Northern Colorado, which is about an hour northeast of Denver in the city of Greeley, he was a newspaper reporter. As a regent, I would often turn to Ken for his counsel and insight on how the public and press would react to events at the university. And trust me on this, Ken is really good at his job. Ken, thanks so much for being here today.
It's a pleasure for me to be here, Regent Emeritus Ludwig.
I did get that title. Um, so we'll just jump right into it. One of the many responsibilities for trustees for colleges or universities is to protect the institution's reputation. But before we talk about what they can do, from your experience, what are the most important things a university or college can do to safeguard the university's or institution's reputation?
I think a primary thing is they have to know that these are big, complex places and they're life changing places, and wonderful things happen there, but also bad things happen. People do bad things, they do stupid things, they do illegal things. And as I used to always tell leadership, we're going to get some of both, and we have to take the bad with the good, and we have to face up to the bad as well as promote the good. So just recognizing the kind of places these are and the kind of things that can happen, and always putting your best foot forward when you have the opportunity. I mean, the day-to-day job that I had, a big part of it was, talking about the great, wonderful, life-changing things that happened there. So it's kind of a mixture.
I hadn't, most people don't think about this, of course, before they become a trustee, probably, is that, oh, there's thousands or tens of thousands employees, and there's thousands, if not tens of thousands of students, and people behave the way people behave. And sometimes that's going to be in, as you said, illegal or inappropriate ways that have an impact on the institution.
Yeah, and it's really throughout the organization. I mean, trustees and regents are really looking at what's happening at the top of the organization, but as often as not, when crises or problems come, they certainly come at the top of the organization, but they also come at every level below that.
Right. And so do you think trustees should just be ready? Like you're going to have to deal with something in your time as a trustee or regent.
I think absolutely. I think if you go along and you never have to face a crisis or an issue that's got a substantial public component, you should go buy lottery tickets, because these things happen at these places, particularly public universities that are public facing, a lot of scrutiny on them. The University of Colorado, where you and I spent our time, was under a microscope virtually every day. And we used to lament a little bit, well, why can't they look at Colorado State University or the University of Northern Colorado or some of the others? And the answer was, when you're the big dog, people are going to look at you.
Right. And I think some people, like if they're at a smaller school, they might think they can dodge the bullet, but that's never a safe strategy, is it?
No, it's never a safe strategy. The bullet will come for you at some point. You know, your best bet, I think, is kind of trying to anticipate the things that are going to happen, while understanding that you're not always going to anticipate them. But, you mentioned reputation. That's a big ongoing thing that you work on every day. But naturally, fiscal matters are always under the microscope. Malfeasance goes along with that, academic misconduct. And universities are complex places. If people don't understand kind of how they operate from within. So, for instance, you and I had I think what we could safely call a crazy faculty member, and the response from people outside the organization is, well, just fire them. And of course, we know that with tenured faculty, it's just not that easy.
Right. Yeah, and there's all sorts of stuff faculty can be accused of, but there's a process that they get due process like everyone else, and their process, especially for tenured faculty, tends to be very, very rigorous, especially depending on which campus it's on. Yeah,
Yeah, it's a world unto its own, and it's got its own set of often arcane rules and regulations. And then you throw on top of that just the normal stuff that any um, private company deals with, the opportunity to get sued.
yeah,
Uh,
all over. I've always felt like the universities are always getting sued for something.
oh, yeah.
Always felt like there was a couple lawsuits pending at all times.
They have robust legal departments for a reason.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. What do you think a trustee or regent can do to help with the reputation management, let's say?
I think understanding their own role first and foremost, and
You should have
using
said, "Listen to the PR guy." Listen to the PR guy was the
well,
first
I'll
answer,
get
right?
to that. I'll get to that point. Uh, really using the staff as a resource. You know,
Yeah.
you we all have the common goal of making the institution look good, putting its best foot forward, telling its success stories. So we're all in it together. I think regents and trustees have a different role. Obviously, they have a fiduciary responsibility on elected boards, they have responsibility to people who elected them. But I think that it's critically important for trustees and regents to use the tools that are there. Um, working with you, Steve, was always great because first and foremost, you understood what my role was, and even though this is your field, communications, I felt like it was always a collegial kind of relationship where you in effect were my boss and you could have told me what to do, but it was never that way. It was always a thing of we bounce things back and forth off each other. And I felt like that was a great resource for me because even though I've got a lot of smart, accomplished colleagues around me, they don't always understand the communication world. So, to expand that out, trustees and regents taking advantage of professionals, I think it helps them.
Mhm.
And it helped me tremendously when they would work with me. You
Yeah.
know, I love to get the calls that said, I got a call from a reporter and I want to talk to you before I call them back. I hated to get the calls of, I just spoke to such and such yesterday in the Post.
Yeah,
It's like, okay, well, I'll read what you said in the paper tomorrow, but I
yeah.
can't much help you.
Yeah, most boards usually have their, so the University of Colorado board is somewhat unusual, because it is elected. There are 4 states elect their boards. It's Colorado, Nevada, Nebraska, and, Michigan, but that's most of the time, it's the board chair that has the authorization to speak on behalf of the board. Isn't that what you've seen around the country from your compatriots?
Yeah, that's typically what you see, and that's typically what I would recommend. In Colorado and the states you mentioned, it's a little different because when you have elected officials, some of those elected officials are going to say, I'm not, the board chair doesn't speak for me. And particularly like in Colorado, when you have a partisan board, you have
Mhm,
Democrats and Republicans on the board, and they're not always going to be lockstep on things. I did find that on most of the thorniest issues, most challenging issues, the regents were smart enough to let their chair speak on their behalf.
yeah.
And, message discipline is a very difficult thing in a big, far flung organization. And it's also,
What is message discipline for people that might not know?
well, it's agreeing on what we are going to talk, how we are going to talk about any particular issue, ideally having a single spokesperson, but, you know, to use the cliche, singing from the same song sheet.
Mhm.
And, certainly there's nuance to that, there's variance to that, but core messages are important.
Yeah, if I came out if any trustee or regent comes out against the agreed upon talking points, that's fodder for the press right there. Like there's discord in the board. I always felt like any disagreement should stay internal and public. You put forward and unless there are always exceptions, but for the most part, you put forward a single face and you handle your disagreements in house.
Absolutely, and that's important. I mean, I was a reporter, you were a reporter in radio, and you know that what reporters love is to play one person in the organization against the other, and particularly if you can get a conflict going and people contradicting each other, and things just snowball from there.
Yeah.
So,
The press loves conflict, right? And yeah, I was in radio and TV, that was all the time. Now, I'm glad you brought that up. So that's a great transition to my next question. You were a newspaper reporter, you covered higher education. What do you think that trustees, but this is probably just any member of the public, but what do you think trustees and regents don't understand about the news media that it's really important to get to understand, where the news media is coming from, that they're not necessarily the villain in this case. And I notice how I said not necessarily. They're not the villain. They're doing their job.
no, they can be the villain, and certainly you and I have seen ones that are the villain. I think most reporters are people who've got a job to do, and
Mhm.
their job is to fairly and even-handedly report a story, and that means getting perspective from both sides. I think there's a tendency on the part of regents and trustees, and also in the leadership of the institution, to think they are out to get us. And, sometimes you do have reporters who are out to get you. Part of my job was always to work with the reporters and, talk to them a little behind the scenes or off the record about what the issue was. But part of my job was also explaining to leadership, regents, trustees that, look, we're going to serve ourselves much better if we are straightforward about things, if we're, I don't like the word, but it's used a lot, if we're transparent about things, um, and we tell the truth. I mean, number one, always tell the truth, because you will most always get caught in a lie, and it's much worse then. So I think that, understanding that these people have a job to do and they're going to do it. And sometimes we, as a university, we ask for it. I mean, again, stupid things, illegal things. And when those things happen, sometimes just best to say, that's stupid, that's illegal. Then the question is, what are you going to do about it? And
Right.
if
I
you
mean,
need to apologize, you apologize. But I think the media really, part of their role is to make a difference and make some changes. And you see that most often in the legislative realm. But I think as a university, if you can say, we messed up there and we need to make sure that doesn't happen again.
and I think that's a nice change I've seen over the past, I don't know, 10 or 15 years, where organizations, especially some higher education institutions. I always felt that the University of Colorado did a good job at that, of saying, here's where we blew it, take the lumps, make some changes, and be clear on what the changes are. And and you had to deal with reporters day in and day out. And sometimes they had a point of view that we may not have agreed with. But if they're chasing the facts, and sometimes it's like, well, is that really a story? That's not for us to say. Generally, that's for them and their editors to figure out. What do you think the biggest misunderstanding is, or the mistake that trustees or regents make when dealing with the news media?
And before I say that, let me go back and say you just touched on something, and that's um, the misconception that somehow you control the media.
Oh, good, yeah.
And you know,
You
I
don't? I thought that was your job.
I would
I
have,
thought you just picked up the phone and they did what you said.
no, not hardly. I would have, I think this is more the case with the leadership of the institution than, I mean, the administrative leadership, than the trustees and the regents. Um, they would ask me to, like, tell them not to write that story or tell them that's not a story. And I would say, if they've called me about it, it's a story.
Yep.
Um, and, when I own the Denver Post or the Wall Street Journal, things will be different, but I don't own them now. I'm not making the decisions. And once they have called me and want to talk to you, the decision on that story has already been made.
Yeah, that brings up a great question. It's like, so I don't like the story, whatever the story is. I'm angry. I call you, the PR guy, and I say, go fix it or go get a retraction because they implied something or they quote unquote misquoted me. Why doesn't that work? That's a
And
leading there's a leading question for you.
it's a hard one because I've experienced that.
Yeah.
Demand a retraction. And I would say, well, what was factually wrong? And oftentimes it was nothing. It was a matter of nuance or interpretation. Um, and certainly, if a media outlet had a factual error, I would be the first one on the phone saying to them, "You got this wrong. You need to correct it." But a lot of times it was contextual. It was interpretation. The "I was misquoted" is a really hard one. And there were instances in my career when somebody assured me I was misquoted, and okay, I will call the reporter about it. And the reporter said, well, I have the tape right here if you'd like to listen.
Oh, oh boy. Yeah. Wow.
You know, Also, you have to pick your battles.
Yeah.
Some things are really big, and some things are small stuff. And as the saying goes, don't sweat the small stuff. And I think to me, my job in part was I was like a basketball coach working the referee. I'd call him up and I would mildly complain and, hey, I thought this was not quite put how it should have been, knowing that I wasn't going to get any satisfaction with that story, but also knowing that maybe the next time they would think, give it longer thought. And also, you know, I needed reporters to see me as an honest broker
Yeah.
and to trust me. And, I can count on one hand the number of times in my 30-year career that I said to a reporter, I want to talk to your editor because I felt like I wouldn't get any satisfaction with the reporter. I always made it a point to develop a personal relationship with them. I understood their job. It was part of my job to make sure they understood mine. But it's very much a relationship, and it served the university well, I think.
You know this happened when I was on the board. A columnist that I didn't particularly care for uh said the regents did this. I know they did it for this reason. I'm certain. And it wasn't true. And there's what's the difference between a columnist and a reporter in this case? And I know like part of me just wanted to rage at him, but I also didn't want to kick the story.
Well, reporters presumably report the facts in a
Mhm.
straightforward manner. They quote people, they, cite the numbers. Columnists are opinion spouters,
Mhm.
and that's their job. And a lot of that job is to be provocative. And they have a bit more latitude with what they say. They can say things like, I know that, or I believe that they did this intentionally, whether they did or not. But again, I think it's the same response as it's my job or even a regent or trustee's job to say to the columnist, and this is always after the fact, of course, hey, I think you got this wrong, and here's why. That doesn't mean the next day the columnist is going to write, oh, I got this wrong. But again, it's the work and the referee principle.
Yeah. The so I mentioned kicking the story. And so what that generally means is I'm unhappy with the story, so I issue a response. And what that does is it puts the story in play for another day. Right. Has that
Yeah,
did that happen to you on occasion or more than one occasion?
more than one occasion. I
Yeah.
think sometimes we're our own worst enemy
Yeah.
about perpetuating stories. Ideally, you want things, bad news to be a 1 day story and good news to have an extended shelf life. But if thou doth protest too much,
Yeah.
you can make 1 day stories into 1 week stories. And worse, the gist of that story is a paragraph that is repeated in future stories for sometimes years. You will recall the story about a salary increase one of the top executives at the university received when other people were not receiving them. And many people thought it was excessive. And there was so much protesting about it, part of which I was directed to do against my better advice, that showed up in the story literally for a year.
Yeah.
That paragraph.
Oh, yeah. And boy, did that annoy everyone. Yeah, sometimes, and you can't do anything about it.
Can't do anything about it.
Yeah. So if I'm so boards are becoming some boards what are public boards are generally appointed by the governor. And we're seeing across the country this is becoming boards are becoming more partisan or more apt to make political statements. What's the
Yeah.
challenge if I'm a disgruntled, I don't like the way the university president's doing something, I don't like the way the board's behaving. What what's the challenge if I go behind the back and leak something to the press anonymously? What
You
does
know,
that do? What does that do to the institution? What does it do to the board?
it's crippling for a number of reasons. Number one, the initial story hurts the university. And when you get to the point where people are leaking, whether it's trustees or regents or administrators or faculty, they're disgruntled and they've determined their court of last resort is to go to the media. And the media will happily listen to them and happily report on them. I think um, the biggest drawback to this, and you've experienced this, is it creates a climate of distrust either on the board, in the administration, or with the board and the administration, to where you're looking at your colleagues thinking, who leaked this? And you and I have both sat in very uncomfortable and heated executive sessions where people flat out accuse others of doing it. And, probably in some of those cases, they were right. I say to people about leaks, finding leaks like a dog chasing its tail, you never catch it. And if you did catch it, what would you do with it?
Yeah.
So it's just devastating. You would hope that people, as you brought up earlier, have honest disagreements with each other, hopefully behind closed doors, but sometimes in public, that they can confront people who they feel like are doing things wrong or doing things the wrong way. But boy, it's just demoralizing to an incredible degree when someone goes to the media in that way.
Yeah. What so let's talk a little bit more about sometimes the board and the president don't agree. And if it happens too much, you tend to get a new president. But a lot of times the PR person reports to the president or the chancellor of that campus, but they're also dealing with the board all the time. What do you think? We talked about some of this earlier, but what should a trustee or regent or governor know about your job when there's that conflict and how that kind of puts you in the middle?
It's a great question. I used to tell all our regents and trustees I worked with before that, look, I work for the president. He's my boss. Don't tell me anything you don't want me to tell him. At the same time, the regents are my boss's boss, and they are looking to me sometimes for advice, guidance, help. And most all of the time, I'm happy to help them. But you do get in those uncomfortable situations where you're in the middle and the president is pulling one direction and the board member is pushing the other direction. And, I'd always have to come down on the side of my boss and, hopefully talk to both and say, look, here's how the board sees this, here's how the president sees this. and maybe in some way broker a resolution. But it's an incredibly difficult and uncomfortable position for someone who is in my position to be in.
I've seen you have to manage that, and I have empathy for you and everyone else that does your job around the country, because it's just tricky, especially, board members have big egos generally. They wouldn't be on a board probably otherwise, and the presidents or chancellors have big egos. They wouldn't be in that job if they didn't probably, and so that's a challenging thing.
And I
Now
think too, I think also, particularly on appointed boards, you've got accomplished people who have had success in some career endeavor, and they are used to solving problems and making decisions and getting things done. And suddenly, when you're in a position where it's not your call, I mean, it is after a fashion, but it's not directly your call on how we're going to solve this problem. And there's a disagreement. So I think, my advice always is what's best for the institution.
Mhm.
And if that's our starting and ending point, we're doing good. Because when you step away out of your individual role, whether you're a president, a regent, a trustee, a communication person, and you're saying what's best for the university, I think you're in a good place.
I was known for being passionate, and that's a
I'm
nice
not
euphemism
you, no.
for having, uh I hopefully it didn't come across as a temper, but maybe a little bit of that. And I later on, as I grew in the role and grew as a human being, I finally learned to ask myself the questions: what's running the show today? My commitments or my ego? And then if my commitments are running the show, like to the university, then it's like, okay, you can continue this line of inquiry if you're set up about something that's okay to pursue. And it's like, no, my ego got bent out of joint for whatever reason. It's like, okay, step back, take a look at this again. It probably doesn't really matter the way making it matter to me. And so that took a long time. That took a long time for me to get there. And that was part of my maturation process as a board member. Um, but it was just something that I noticed I had to go through.
And I think that's an important point for any board member. People come to the board and they're not dummies. They're smart people. Again, they're accomplished people. And you get thrown into a situation, and, higher ed is a world unto its own. And to
Mhm.
think that you're going to understand its history, its nuance, its culture, there's a steep learning curve. And it's
There's
not
this,
just
yeah.
how the university runs, but it's really what's the university's culture and what's my role in it. I was always very careful, um, never to, or on very rare occasions, to use my title to get something done, or even more so to say, the president wants you to do X. Because people dig their heels in and they don't do X, they do Y. So I think growing into yourself, whether you're an administrator, but particularly if you're a regent or a trustee, is an important thing. And it's important to be mindful that this is a process, that I don't have all the answers, and that it's a long process.
Now, we'd be remiss if we don't talk about social media when it comes to this. So if I'm having a disagreement and the university issue, it's like, oh, that's nonsense, and I fire off a tweet. And that's almost as bad as I mean, that's just fodder for the press these days, isn't it?
It is, and social media is obviously ubiquitous, and you and I have both seen regents and trustees who will say, "Well, I'm speaking as a private citizen. I'm not speaking as a regent," and we both know that if there's a story in the newspaper, you are not going to be identified as private citizen Stephen Ludwig. You're going to be identified as Regent Stephen Ludwig. My advice on social media is the Miranda advice. Anything you say can and will be used against you, and
Yeah.
it'll be used out of context. It'll be used down the road, and that stuff lives forever. So, my advice is the more circumspect, the better.
Now, I don't want to. This is going to sound weird, and I certainly don't want to Sound like I'm advising trustees not to be forthcoming. But when it comes to public institutions, especially in states with sunshine laws, there has to be a level of care in anything, right? In email or texting or any communication. Um, you have to be careful, like it could wind up in the press.
Yeah, I think the advice that you've heard me give and that many people give is if you think about how this is going to look on the front page of the Denver Post
Mhm.
when these things come out, and certainly you and I have both seen our share of bad headlines, bad stories over emails, and if I had it to do over in my newspaper reporting career, the typical thing is. Uh, File an open records request for the regent's emails or the trustees' emails or text messages or the president's. But if I had to do over, I would be requesting the communication guy or the chief of staff along with that because
Yeah.
that's where the real discussion goes on. So, people have to be incredibly aware of what they're writing in emails and text messages.
Again, it's not to do anything shady or deny the public access to public product. It's like if it's a public institution, I think all of that is absolutely fair game. I believe personally in sunshine laws. It does create some headaches on having complicated conversations, but I think overall it's a general good. So it's not like we're trying to advise people to avoid stuff, but there's things like if you've I've been known to fire off some emails that I'm very happy no one asked for because I would be embarrassed that they made it to the public because I was upset about something and I didn't think it through.
Yeah, and by the same token, I think that is very true. Be mindful of what you're committing to the public record out there. At the same time, I've had colleagues or bosses who, well, I had one who didn't have email, and that was probably a good thing overall.
Mhm.
Um, I've had people who are afraid to say anything, and I was there a little bit myself. I would write, these terse emails. Um, And I was talking to a colleague in another institution, and I said, I'd hate for the press to get text messages from some of the text messages that I get from my friends on my public phone. And he said, "Do you think you're the only one with idiot friends?" Sometimes media, they're not so interested in everything as you might imagine.
Yeah.
They're interested in pertinent things.
Yeah. It is that balance between being paranoid and being, diligent.
Yeah, healthy
Yeah.
paranoia is
Yeah.
probably a good thing.
So, you've worked with 2 boards, you've talked to colleagues around the country. Are there a couple common mistakes that trustees and regents makes that are really avoidable when it comes to, safeguarding the institution's reputation as a board member?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is, and I talked earlier about using the staff and the professionals as a resource. I think the biggest mistake is bringing them in too late on an issue.
Mhm.
Um, I used to have a saying, if you want me on the landing, include me on the takeoff. Uh, in my uh, first posting at the University of Northern Colorado, I was never allowed to sit in on executive session meetings.
So
Although
explain what that is for people that might not know.
So executive session is a legal construct by which a board can talk about personnel, legal, or property issues. Because
Outside of the
sometimes
outside of the public sphere, so the public can't
outside
see
of the
that stuff,
public
yeah.
sphere. So it's a closed room with typically just the board and some staff members. At the University of Colorado, I was included in all of those, and I can't tell you how invaluable it was for me to have that inside information just so I could, do what I needed to do to conceive, okay, how are we going to talk about this? What are the pitfalls that we could see down the road? So bringing your people in early and, just, hey, we've got issue X. What do you think of this? How is this going to play out? Is this even an issue? Um, just kind of bouncing things off the wall. So, involving your people early and certainly involving them is critical.
Well, as you know, we talked about my communications background, and I always felt I was way too close to the issues to have an objective point of view anymore about how these would go. So having you or someone like you in the room was always incredibly valuable, and we would look for you for guide, like how is this going to land for people, and then also having the communications person in the room, like you get to know how your board members think, and that
Exactly.
has to be super helpful.
Yeah, it's incredibly helpful not only to know who they are as people, how they think, but what is the dynamic with other board members and with the president. And, I think a dangerous place for a communication person to be is to think, I've got all the answers. And if they don't listen to me, they're a bunch of idiots. Um, you need to know that there are people out there who have insight, opinion, perspective that is going to inform in a positive way what you need to do to move the institution forward. So, for me, it was casting as wide a net as possible.
Mhm. So I've got two more questions for you. Do you have any favorite anecdotes about regents or trustees that you'd be willing to share? And if
Boy,
you don't, that's certainly understandable.
do I have to be Minnie Pearl and name names?
No, they're probably best for you and everyone else not to name names.
There was certainly times throughout my career when I gnashed my teeth and just wondered why people did things. No one incident sticks out in my mind, but I also need to remind myself. I didn't need to remind myself. I saw reminders of it every day. People care about the institution. They're serving, in the case of our regents, they're elected officials who are not paid. Um, and I think most trustees, not elected officials, but appointed, who are not paid, they serve because of the good of the institution, the good of the state. So even though there was plenty of bumps in the road and maddening things, I always greatly admired and respected the fact that regents and trustees were willing to serve and willing to do this very difficult job that, it's a thankless job. Seldom do people call you up and say, hey, that went well, great job. You are almost always getting the, you are terrible, you are an idiot,
Mhm.
you messed it up, you need to fix this. So, um, you know, I, I I ended my career having wonderful, and throughout my career, had wonderful respect for regents and trustees.
It really being a regent for 12 years for the University of Colorado, I loved it and it drove me bananas, right? So it was both. It's just one of those things, and it's one of those things that yeah, you're there for the most everyone's there for the right reasons. Before we finish, what do you think the best part of working for a university is? What is it for you that you enjoyed it so much? You gave so much of your career to higher ed.
Well, I was incredibly fortunate to be able to work for my alma mater. And, I'm a product of public education, just like you are. I worked my way through school. I saw the power of public education and I lived the promise of it. So, being able to be a part of that, I although I did teach a few classes here and there, I wasn't in daily contact with students except the students who worked in our office. But no matter how peripheral, being part of this enterprise that changes people's lives, changes society, brings so much value to states, um, it just made me feel proud to be a part of it, no matter how small.
I couldn't agree more. What a great enterprise to be a part of, regardless of the campus, public or private, right? Private nonprofits or publics.
Exactly.
It's really great. I always felt like we're in the life transformation business
Absolutely.
through education, through research, and through healthcare. It's just the best. Well, Ken, thank you so much for your time. This has been a great conversation. It was great seeing you, and thank you again for your time.
It's a pleasure, Steve, always, and best of luck to you. I think this is important work. I hope that the regents and trustees out there have some things they can take away from not just this episode, but your other episodes. And I'm sure they do.
Great. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.